you guys. Thank you for making it. This is going to be a workshop, quasi also like the launch of these two parts. Enlightened is my second title, and the first part's launch happened at MICA in Ahmedabad. So today we have part 2 and 3, but I've been getting consistent feedback because I do a lot of sessions on these, and they're like, we wanted more of the interaction to happen. Because the question part, like I kind of did an hour-long session, and then the questions were long 15 minutes or 20 minutes. So this time it's going to be a lot more interactive. So I'll just run through quickly with everything related to the story and a bit about how these graphic novels are made, and then we will start taking questions. Cool. The story relies on genetic engineering. So the idea is there's something called the phantom DNA effect. A lot of people believe it's a hoax. So it's a way to understand how DNA can actually leave energy footprints. And there's a group of people in Russia who believe that all the greatest people ever to be born on the face of Earth have been born with a similar DNA match. And they're trying to find the match for everybody, pretty much. Hitler and the likes. And there's this one guy in China who believes there must be a match for Buddha as well. What are the chances that you would actually find the DNA profile match for Buddha? First question is, do you have the DNA profile of Buddha? So he figures out a way to actually get the DNA profile of Buddha, and then he's on a search, on a mission to find out where the match is. So the protagonist actually happens to have the match. So how he finds him and everything else is the crux of the story. So the idea is all the characters that existed in Buddha's timeline are actually there in the story. So they're all there. They don't know who the actual guy is, but then they find out at the end. And the story has multiple interpretations in the climax in the last part. It's got a 3-part act, like any other story. The third part is when we actually give the question to the audience as to whether or not the character is Buddha. So there could be multiple interpretations to it. So we're not saying this is rebirth or reincarnation. You'd have to actually read the story. And the story will be adapted into multiple media formats like transmedia. Because you can't tell a story this complex in graphic novels. That's what we realized after we made the novel, because a lot of people didn't really understand it. At least even the editors who were making things, but we still made the effort. So we will make an effort to put it on video, put it on an animation format to see the work goes out. But that's the basic idea of the story. So DNA profiles, haplogroups, genetics. It's very, I would say it's very technical, but then you could actually do some research there to appreciate the story a lot more, to understand why we chose that. So the idea is to tell people that the events will be the same. So if you know Buddha's story, he's born into a very rich family, but here he's born into a family of arms manufacturers. In fact, India's biggest private arms manufacturer. So they're into the business of making wars happen. So in the Iron Man style, he finds himself in an aircraft where his own ammunition tries to take him down. And then he realizes, and then he comes back. So that's the story around this character. So I hope people will be able to match it and understand what happened. But I'm giving this out now because if you don't know about this background, it'll be very hard for you to put things in perspective. So that's a bit about the story. So these are the cover pages. The first one you may have seen, there's a Buddha on half side, and there's this guy, and then there's a DNA thing. So once you read the entire story, you'd have to go back to it to sort of put pieces together. So I've always been a big fan of things where you'd have to go back to it to understand it better. Every time you read, you have something new to discover. So this, I'm hoping, is one such story. So that's the framework of it. And then a bit about how graphic novels are made, because last time when we did a session, a lot of people asked us, how do you guys actually make graphic novels? What does it take to break into the industry? Or how does it work? So in India, as you guys may know, it's very unorganized. We don't have a massive industry like in the US or Japan. So The work is the same. You need to have an idea first, and then the idea is actually taken on to a thumbnail format. So you have little boxes like window panes where you'd have to do a sketch telling people what you want to see in that pane. So it's a bit like storyboarding for movies. And then from there, the artists will do something called penciling. So they'll come out with a pencil draft. On top of it, there's something called inking, which then goes on to the computer where they sort of work on it in Photoshop to change things. And that's like your black and white format. And from there, there's color, and then there's letters. So all these phases put together is the actual production of a graphic novel. So it's a lot of people, and a lot of times people think it's the same artist who does it, but it's different people. So the best of the penciling guys may not be as good as the colorists, or the colorists may have no idea about inking. So you need all these people in the ecosystem to bring out something like this. But this idea that you need an aircraft and there's a fight sequence with people who've got these World War II masks has to come from the writer. So that's the sequence that you envision, and the cover page has to have these elements. So that was basically my idea. I wanted to have, these are some of the core sequences in the story, so they needed to go out there as the cover pages. So yeah, that's a bit about how graphic novels are made. On the business side, I think we're struggling as an industry in India because our retail is not so organized, so it's very unorganized. So you can find comic books for as low as 5 rupees on the streets at a near price of, I think, 10. The lowest price I've seen is 8 rupees. It's available near the Bond store. You can pick it up. It's as low as that. I've seen comic books in grocery stores. I've seen comic books at railway stations. I've seen comic books being sold together with milk. So all kinds of things, right? So you can't track it. Unlike, say, in established or mature markets like the US or Japan too, where you have these stores. We do have an organized retail network, but it's maybe 10% of the entire industry. So that is dominated by Marvel and DC, which is why you don't see a lot of Indian authors or publishers putting their work out there. And it's very hard to get the price point right. Like, this is my personal experience that a lot of people are not willing to invest $100 on an Indian comic, but they'd buy a Marvel or a DC for 3,000 rupees. So you'd have to admit that the artwork is superior. The American comic book industry is way more advanced in the way they do their art. It's not that we can do it, it's just that we can't get the price point right. So if you pay an artist the prices that exist in the US market, you'll not be able to meet the price point for the graphic novel, which is why we sort of compromise on a lot of things. So some of the consistent feedback that I received, I met this really high-end official at a top-notch production studio, and he wasn't too impressed with the work that we were doing. And the reason he had was like, I work with Marvel and DC, I got no time for things like these. He thought it was substandard. But the idea is, if you're a startup, you would not be able to, you can, but there are a lot of people who try to get into that space. So if you see great artwork, there's a chance that they're not selling so much because the market isn't just there. So we decided to do something more substantial, give it time, put in as many titles as we can into the market. So 10 years down the line, people know that we've done a great body of, or we've built a great body of work for the title. So that's on the business side, which is why you don't hear about these things unless you go looking for it. If you go on Google right now, maybe you'll see some literature or some links about the work we're doing, but you're not going to find it on the streets. Like, it's not going to be in your face, like a Batman or a Superman. I think they're public properties now. They've been around for so long that you don't have to give any introduction. So yeah, I will now start taking questions on the thing because that's what the session is for. So if you have any questions on novels or the story or how things are made, feel free. So you can start asking and I'll start taking questions. Yeah.
So the very good point that you made was about the pricing part of it. So from what I read from the child, So the pricing is always, there are two types of comics. One is like something that comes out weekly, bi-weekly, that we subscribe to, which is not that of a high price, and something like from Marvel or DC, or something that comes from an international publisher, which is quite expensive. In order to balance that, so what kind of audience do you want to target? So because when I say when people want to buy Marvel and DC, most of them don't want to just buy for the stories and to read, they also buy it as a collector's item, right? So when someone wants to buy a series of comics, it's also a part that they say that it's also pride of ownership for them, that I have this many series, I have this much of a collection of a Marvel or a DC. It's also the brand value that comes with it as well. So, from your point of view, do you want to develop a brand value or do you want to tell a story more than a brand value?
I think the easiest way is to say we want to do both, but the idea is to tell the story first. Yeah, and I strongly believe building a brand takes a lifetime. It can't be done overnight. As much as a lot of people would like to, brands are built over a 100-year span. Though now they believe in the new internet era, you can still put brands out there in a span of say 10 to 15 years. The branding would be the publisher's concern, and even in the Indian comic book industry, there were really big names in different decades. So Chandamama did really well until the 70s maybe. Then you had Raj Comics, which were pretty big in the 80s, especially in the Hindi-speaking belt. And it's a multilingual market that we have in India, so there's not one language. So if you want to have that sort of a brand all over India, you need to be a multilingual, publisher going out in all the languages to reach out pan-India. Pretty much what Bahubali did. You see, it reached out to people because it had the same kind of reach in all the languages. But if you're doing English, you're reaching out to the urban Indian market. If you're doing vernacular, you're reaching out to the regional market. So you need a title to go in that direction. So what are we trying to do now? Hindi is coming out. I'm planning to do something in my first language as well as in Gujarati because that's where the publisher is from. So we will try to have a footprint in maybe 4 or 5 languages because that's going to give us the kind of reach. As far as building brand goes, it could happen or it may not happen. I mean, it could just happen overnight. Something might just set that spark and you happen to go viral and then everyone's like reading about it. Or it may not happen even in 20 years. So it'd be hard to comment on that part, but then the idea is to tell stories and really good ones and unique ones. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
You have Iron Man, you have Spider-Man, you have Captain America. Have you ever in future planned to have one single superhero in the Indian world instead? Have you ever planned for it or do you have anything of that in mind?
Vigilante hacker. So the guy has a mask and he's trying to steal from banks. It's related to cryptocurrencies and bitcoins and everything. So it was like very futuristic. So we are building a universe. So the publisher has a universe called Fenilverse, where there's lots of characters. So these are all superheroes in their own ways. These are origin stories for that reason. So we decided to stick to the origin stories and have a great origin story. Well, if you see Batman, it's the same story, right? In every Batman movie, we see his parents getting shot and then he becomes Batman. But people don't mind watching it because the story is so good. So it's got that emotional hook, which is what we're trying to do with the characters. So the first character I built is an economic superhero in a certain sense. He's a vigilante, so he steals from the banks, he's moving money into other institutions that are helping the poor, so it's got the whole Robin Hood theme. The second one is more to do with the Oriental philosophy, so they're relying on Buddha's life. The next character I'm building is the proper superhero that you're talking about. Comes from another planet, but we're connecting it to our mythologies like Ramayana and Mahabharata. So he's someone who's existed for that long, and he's seen the wars, he's seen everything, and he also exists in present day, and he's helping the space agencies in India. So he's this aerospace engineer during the day, but people don't know that he's the reason behind why India's space program is so successful. So there's a parallel history track to it. things like that. So we're trying to build the origins. So I think in the future, that's when we will go in the direction of making them established brands with their own bad guys, and the entire, story builds around them. So right now we're in the origin phase, and the idea is to make them brands where people can relate to these characters. And we're also doing interconnected plots now. So in this story, there's my first character that appears. So this guy wants to hack into a system, so he approaches the hacker. So the hacker is actually in the story and he's connected. In the third story, both these guys will appear. So we're trying to connect all the characters that are there in the universe. But yeah, I think it's kind of early to sort of judge if they become someone like that. But the idea is to make them brands like that. So we're focusing on the origin now, and hopefully we'll go in the direction of making them really, established, organized characters. There's another point called intellectual property, and I was told recently that countries like Taiwan have 150 established intellectual property for organized characters. The only character they can think of in India is Chota Bheem. And there's only 1 or 2 in India. And a country like India should have had like 1 million. And someone like a Taiwan can have 150. We should have like, I don't even know how many. That's the sad part. So that's where we are focused at the moment. So we have copyrights from the Indian government on the characters we're building. We want to license it and franchise in that model. The concern is anyone can write a great character, but will it sustain and will it become the kind of character that can actually have audience in all age groups? So you could have an animation, you could have a live action feature film, you could have toys, have all kinds of things. So we're working in that direction.
A lot of technology involved in the story as well. So do you particularly start out age group before having this concept in mind? Because after raising that up, I think there's a lot of economics involved in that. Stories, I think the children of the age group maybe they might not be able to understand what you're trying to say. So before writing the story, do you have to think in your mind that particular age group that you're looking for a particular age group or something like that?
I'd have to say it is definitely targeted for 18 plus. It's mature in the sense it's not graphic violent, but the themes need a bit of an understanding of what's going on. So we haven't made it for that segment, and it was a conscious decision because the kind of stories that I write are very technical, and that's what I want to be known for. So if you ask me to build a story which is pretty much accessible by people of all age groups, I'm not really sure. So I think you're spot on in the sense that it's not for everybody. The first story wasn't. This is, I think, a little more universal in that sense. Like people will be able to relate to it. The next one's going to be a bit more toned down in terms of space, because you could do a lot of space there. Make it like interstellar, time and dimensions and all of that, or just focus on the superhero and his powers and just to do with his origin. So I would say we've only focused on 18 plus, and males have been predominantly the category that have been consuming this kind of content. Don't know why, but I think that's how it's been. However, we'd like to expand that base, but it happens with time, I think. Word of mouth, people hear about this, and then they'll pick up a copy, they'll read about it, and then they like it. And there's also the negative effect. So if you don't like economics, I can't think of how you'll enjoy this story, the first story, because it was grounded in economics. He's an economist in the story, right? So there's a lot of theory about economics, and that's how the story begins. And then that's how he becomes a hacker, and he knows the system of banking, and that's how he plays with it. So that's kind of like rooted in itself. But there has been a consistent feedback from my publisher to tone down the technical part so it can reach out to more audience. At least that's what happened in the feature film, in the movie where we just went, there were no holds barred, we just went so deep that some of the concepts could be stuff that you read in Financial Times. But yeah, the idea is to make it more broad-based, but I think everybody has to start with a niche first, and then they kind of like expand. So we're in that phase right now, and it's 18 plus at the moment. Yeah. Yeah, inspiration is a very good question. I think I just read a lot when I was young. I used to travel. So I think the idea for the first character came in when I was at the European Union, and I was talking to some economists, and I was like, why don't we do this? And I was always a comic book kid. And I was doing all these things in the corporate world, so it's about mixing them. And whenever you get stuck in the corporate world or with a concept, you're thinking, why not? You know, technically there's no possibility for a DNA match, right? That's what science tells you. So I think, why not have a match? So that becomes fiction. That's the element that really gets me going. So when you read about genetics, for instance, it's not possible to have a DNA match. So let's build a story where there is a DNA match. That makes it an extraordinary situation. So for me, I've always been inspired by stories which were extraordinary. So if you just gave me a story which was all drama or the regular things, right, that wouldn't inspire me as much as something like an extraordinary plot would. So that's where the real inspiration comes from. To think about something that's not really possible, can we make it happen? From there I break it down, and the themes happen to be chance. Sometimes I'm reading about some concept somewhere, and it just happens that I would think, okay, this would make a great story. And I watch a lot of these movies that are now being made, and I think they've done a great job of how. Have you seen the movie Watchmen? So it's amazing how they think of parallel history, and it's got all things going on. So when you watch movies, sometimes you get the idea. When you're reading, you get the idea. And you're dealing with things in the real world, you get the idea. Sometimes you just want to punch someone in the face, but you can't do it. So what if you create a story where everyone can punch everyone else? I think that's Fight Club, right? So that's the movie. So I think that's how people think, and my thinking starts from that. So you'll see me building stories which are grounded in science, but then when I know there's a boundary to science, I try to understand why is there that boundary. What if that boundary doesn't exist? That becomes the plot. And then from there on, there's characters, and then there's an arc for the character, and then we build on it further. So the inspiration is, why have the rules, and can we push it? I think fiction is good that way. So you can sort of imagine, and then things could sort of fall in place.
Yeah, it's interesting that you spoke about the boundaries and also the kind of subject which you think cannot be explored, but you can explore in the form of a story or something like a conspiracy theory, as said about the DNA. So my question would be, so there are many novelists and like that who write things on conspiracy theories, and also so most of them end up doing novels, right? Detailed novels. So for me, if I think of it like that, I would like to read, especially the next chapter I was thinking about, I would like to read a novel over it rather than a graphic novel, because I think I want a more detailed read on it. So if I read these 3 parts of a comic book story, it feels too simple for me. So would you think that way?
One of the other questions that I get a lot of times. In fact, for my first story, I was asked to write a proper novel because of the movie had a plot map. So people had to see the plot map to understand which year they were in and where the character was in that year. So it was that complex. Someone said, why don't you write this down? So I do have the draft for the novels, but I'm a very visual person. Like I love images. So it is a fact that I'm facing that concern. When I send my story to the editors, they read it and then they make it very concise for a comic book. I'm only hoping that people would want to research more, but it definitely helps to have a lot of write-up. So maybe in the future, but it's like it's time consuming, right? I mean, you'd have to like you need to write 300 to 400 pages of it, which I do usually when I write a story. So I'm usually typing it up, or it's in my head, or I'm just thinking of things and I put it all over the place, and then it comes out in the form of visual images. So the idea is to give that visual appeal to it, which is why I'm trying to build a transmedia platform where you're also going into animation, you're going into dialogue where you can explain more, also like text. So definitely something that I'm thinking about, not at the moment, but there will be novels as well. So it'd be kind of cool to do that. I think I'll be the only one who would have done stories across all media platforms, right from say television, animation, regular novels to graphic novels. So it requires a lot of effort, but something that I am considering because, as you mentioned, the plots are so complex. You need that kind of text to sort of supplement it.
So, as you said, when you spoke of animation and which are, it's basically, is personification, right? You have written, now this is your second book, you're writing about the future. Have you ever wondered how it would be writing about our past, our history, or as you said, about the epics?
Awesome, like you can take so much from it. So this was the first attempt to actually modernize a plot from the past, and I've read very little of it. That's the concern that I have. Like I really wanted to read a huge text of Mahabharata, like in the actual form, maybe like a massive book. That'll give me a complete understanding. Like I know it from the stories that we've seen from the 80s. Have you seen the Doordarshans? Yeah. So I think for some of them it might be going too early. So if you see those things, I remember every Sunday Ramayana and Mahabharata would play on TV. So you know the characters, you know the references in the culture. So I don't know, it's hard to sort of get excited because you grew up with it, right? You know it is there. But it definitely does cross my mind sometimes as to, can I do something with it? Also, I'm aware of the fact that people are very sentimental about certain things, right? So it can actually also piss people off, is what I've noticed with a lot of other guys in the past. So that's one concern that I have. Like I do have interpretations of what if this happened that way, or just the way things are. And some comic book publishers, in fact, in India, are facing concerns over the way they've depicted a Shiva or other characters, Karna. I spoke to some of them and they're like, hey, you know what? Some people would tell us, you made him look more like Hrithik Roshan. Like that's what I got. The comic book guy, he made Shiva so ripped, he looked like a Bollywood model. So the concern that people had was it was more focused on the way he was actually looking than the appeal. But the other side of the story is this guy saying, if I don't go in that direction, I can't visually attract people. So you may see it if you go online and you check the latest work of Indian gods. They have made them a lot more. Yeah, they've all got abs, and it went to Wall Street. Wall Street Journal actually wrote an article saying Indian gods have now gotten a makeover, and all of them are like ripped and they look menacing. So it's great. In fact, that's the adaptation, right? That's what we're talking about, like retelling it. So my next story starts with that. It starts with the Mahabharata, and there's a bit of a link there to aliens and spaceships, and from there it comes to the real world. So I'm trying to connect both. More than trying to reimagine that, I'm trying to connect both the worlds, saying the origin is there, but it's a modern adaptation.
As an extension to what you just said and what you had to share. We were talking about Taiwan having 150 characters with their own IP, and somehow us Indians not promoting our own Indian stories, which should have been the case. But since we were young, I remember reading a lot of essays about people, but I don't see today's generation being as indulged in those kind of comic books. Today's kids are more about Batman, Superman, and the meaning maybe. But so what is it from our side as either creators or readers or the marketing people can we do to bring out the Indian content onto the public forum and encourage people to indulge more in Indian content and not completely focus on Western characters and all?
There's nothing the readers should do. The readers are perfect. It's a free market, and we have to admit that the American content is far superior to our content as of today. In terms of the business aspects, I'm not talking about the actual content, even that's debatable. So the reason why we're not able to do it is the industry is kind of set up that way. Taiwan, right? They've got so many characters, is what they're saying. Japan has a lot of characters. So does China, I'm assuming. Where we get it wrong is, I'm noticing a lot of people being very good in their, in the value chain, they're very good with their work. So an animation company wants to build something new for someone and make money right away. But they wouldn't want to go back to a Tinkle, as you said, or a Chacha Chaudhary, or all those characters from the 90s which were mighty popular. So the problem is they've never been able to coexist. And Amar Chitrakatha should have ideally produced movies by now, but they are not in that sphere of understanding how movies are working. So they've never thought of it. Similarly, Raj Comics. Raj Comics, Doga. Doga is a very popular character for Raj Comics. And there was talk that John Abraham would play Doga. He's a massive guy. He's a cop, but he becomes a dog-like superhero. The problem is the Bollywood producers and the publishing house could never come to terms. So that's the biggest concern, that all these things are not coming together. They're good in their own right. So Amar Chitrakatha is great with its stories. But who's really good with movies? So you need to ensure that they sort of like come together for that product to evolve. And that needs to start. And it's not like Batman started off, have you seen the 1960s Batman? Yeah, now maybe you would find it funny, right? They've got the Bam, Pow, and the 1960s Adam West Batman, right? So it began there. You should see Thor or an Iron Man of the 1970s. It's basically a box. And so they started somewhere, but they evolved. And I'm completely in favor of that thought, that you need to start somewhere and you need to start evolving over time. The problem is we see an amazing Batman movie and we're like, why don't we have something like that? You will not, because you never started in the 60s. You don't have the path. I mean, the design for the Batsuit is so detailed, but it has gone through ages. The problem for us is, yeah, Tinkle is great, Chacha Chaudhary is great. There was talk that I think Anupam Kher was supposed to play Chacha Chaudhary, and then Great Kali would play a Sabu, because they look perfect for these characters. Why hasn't a filmmaker come forward? I think it's the inability to build a business model at that level that has stopped us from building those, which is where IP comes into picture, which is why we're focusing on IP. All our characters are trademarked. We want to give it out to people. A startup that does animation, please feel free to build animation scripts. But if you think you're going to make money off this at this moment, I don't think my publisher is ready to build an animation movie out of these characters yet. Because there's not enough returns on the book itself. So it's that example of agrarian economies becoming productive, investing in surplus and industrialization, and there's a specific path. So we're still not in the surplus for comics. Or we were, but those guys haven't made the right moves to sort of like move into other domains. And that's where the big issue was for Indian, content. And Chota Bheem, right? Do you know the founder of Chota Bheem? I don't know who Chota Bheem's actual artist is. For all we know, he could be eating biryani somewhere in Delhi or something. We don't know who the guy is. But if he were in the US, he'd be signing autographs at San Diego Comic Con, besides Stan Lee. So that ecosystem is something that has to connect. And in the West, I think it connected itself well. In the hindsight, it appears like it has been really well connected. But I'm sure at some stage they came out. They said, okay, let's reach out, let's do these things. So why are we not able to do it? Because we're not able to connect to the other business model So you're great with your comics, and that's just it. Have you made a transition to digital? No. Because you think digital is going to kill your print sales. That kind of thinking will stop you from going beyond. Have you done any merchandising? I don't really know, because there's not much money there. There's not going to be much money there. You need to build it over a period of time. I'm sure you could always have, I think Chota Beam's merchandise is also pretty crazy. I walk on the streets, I see a lot of Chota Beam bags and little things that the kids would want to own, and it's a great property. I'm sure if you made a movie out of it, but who's going to make the Chota Beam movie? So the guys who are making the movie find it funny how the actors would say, oh, there's not enough content. No, there is, but it's just not coming to you guys the right way. So you guys should go reach out. There are characters. It would be unfair to say there are no such characters. There are characters, but it just needs to go out in the right medium. And in India, I think nothing is bigger than Bollywood or movies in that sense. So you need to have that one big movie that's going to change everything. I still believe 3 Idiots has done a lot for the writer, right? More than say Amir Khan. Amir Khan is still a great star, whether or not he appeared in that movie. But look at what it did to the story. It's brought, I'm sure he's done well for himself even before that, but that's gotten him more stories converted into movies. So you need something like that to happen. That would actually set the ball rolling, and then you'd be able to experiment. Like, I'm sure if the next Batman movie with Ben Affleck, they showed you the story of how his parents would die, you know if they're going to die. You know if they'll be shot in some downtown area, but you'll still watch it because that's how it is. Yeah. It's such a strong story that you would want to see how they showed it. And it's always a different way they show it. So it's about getting that loyalty factor with the audience. And then you can start building multiple variations of it. So I think in India we're missing that. It all relates to the previous question. We don't have that intellectual property sort of building mechanism. Where if you miss the movie, you can go to a store, you'll see a toy. You could go on, I don't know, Cartoon Network, and you'll see an animation. Where you'll see multiple variations of it. You could go to a Comic Con and you're seeing people cosplaying them. So it can vary. So it'll take time. I think we're missing that part in India at the moment. So you're right. I think it's a very important question. So you need to establish that connect. I think it's more a question of accessibility, right? Because urban India now accesses a lot of things in digital. It's a question for the publishers. I've noticed the publishers have a very rigid mindset. I'm not saying my publisher, but then I've noticed that the publishers have not been able to make a transition. To the point some of them said we don't want piracy to happen and they're being trolled on the web. There's no sales in the first place and you're saying you don't want piracy to happen. So it's definitely a question of the mindset of the publishers going out there and saying, this is what it is. And it all comes down to the price point, right? It takes, let's just say, 3 to 5 lakhs of rupees today to build a comic. You're putting that out on YouTube for free. So the economics of it will not match. But someone in a mature industry can afford to do that because this is one avenue for them. Because they know their stream of sales is still intact. But for us, the concern is they're trying to make money out of this, and they can't go digital because I can't think of a possibility where you see it online and you go buy the book.
Yeah.
I'm assuming most of you wouldn't if you read it in the digital format. So that's what's keeping the publishers away. And again, this is very specific to the business model. I think there's a lot of business model concerns that the industry has. The demand is there, we know that. If not, Marvel DC movies wouldn't be doing the kind of sales that they're doing in India. The demand is there. The supply is there too. The sad part is it's not meeting. They're not the same curve. They're actually two different graphs. So we need to create the demand for our content. Unfortunately, right now you're seeing the demand, which is universal for all kinds of graphic novel content, and the supply is coming from the Western publishers. It's just that we need to build the supply track from the publishers.